The Veari Grand Fleet drifted in perfect silence above the plain of the ecliptic, 37,000 vessels arranged in a lattice, so precise that the gravitational perturbations canceled themselves out to 9 decimal places. They had been here for 412 standard cycles, watching a volume of space that had shown no electromagnetic emissions, no neutrino flux, no gravitic ripples, nothing but the faint whisper of the cosmic microwave background. The sector had been declared inert.
Dead.
A place where even entropy seemed to have given up. Grand Strategist Kale, 9 reviewed the null readings for the 10,000th time and felt the familiar itch of wasted vigilance. The Veari did not experience boredom the way lesser species did. They experienced inefficiency, and inefficiency was sin. Confirm absolute sensor dark. Kale, 9 transmitted across the fleet mind. 37,000 sensor officers returned the same answer in perfect chorus. Nothing. 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 Then the universe tore open. It did not announce itself with drama. There was no flash, no thunder of displaced energy, no Cherenkov flume. 1 picosecond the target volume was empty. The next, a ship simply existed where it had not. No jump signature, no warp spasm, no hyperspatial wake. The object had 0 relative velocity to the fleet's rest frame, as though it had always been there and the universe had only just remembered. Kale 9's threat assessment routine spiked into ultraviolet. The intruder was small by Veari standards, barely 800 meters, shaped like a blunt arrowhead, matte black, drinking starlight instead of reflecting it. No emissions, no running lights, no transponder. The hull was laced with faint rectangular scars that hurt to look at directly, as if they were holes in geometry itself. The fleet's combined processing power, equivalent to 60 billion Veari minds, took 0.37 seconds to reach a consensus. Unknown configuration, unknown origin, unknown threat level. Weapons locks were achieved in the next 0.04 seconds. Hold fire, Kale, 9 ordered, a decision so unusual that 3 submines filed immediate protests. The Arrowhead ship did nothing for 6 minutes. Then a single band of soft white light appeared along its dorsal ridge, steady, almost polite. A voice followed, not on any standard frequency, but injected directly into the fleet mind's linguistic root. It spoke flawless High Veari, the dialect used only by the First Clade before the Unification War. Grand Strategist Kale, 9, it said, calm as a tide chart, you are requested to stand down weapons and prepare a docking corridor. We have much to discuss, and very little time. Kale, 9 felt something it had no noun for. The closest approximation was vertigo. Identify, it demanded. The voice answered with a word the Veari had expunged from every archive 40 millennia ago. A word that should not exist.
Human, it said.
The fleet mind fragmented into 2 to the power of 48 parallel arguments in the space between 2 heartbeats. Humans were myth. Humans were cautionary folklore told to frighten newly budded younglings. Humans were the enemy that had vanished so completely that even their absence had been classified as apocryphal. Yet here floated proof. Kale, 9 forced coherence. Humans are extinct. Extinct is a strong word, the voice replied. We prefer selectively non-participatory. May I come aboard? Against every protocol ever written, Kale, 9 granted permission. The human delegation that crossed the docking umbilical was only 3 individuals, but the fleet's tactical auditors registered them as a catastrophe-scale event. The first was tall, dark-skinned, wearing a plain gray uniform without insignia. His eyes were ordinary brown until you noticed they never quite focused on the same point as everyone else's. The second was shorter, East Asian features, hair cropped almost to the scalp, moving with an economy that suggested every gram of mass had been accounted for and justified. The third was a woman with copper-red hair tied back in a braid that floated slightly, as though underwater. She smiled the way a knife smiles. The tall man introduced himself as Captain Elias Okoye, commanding officer of the UNSCV, 01 Longinus. The woman was Commander Riley Shao, chief of theoretical weapons. The third simply called himself Archivist and offered no name. They stood in the strategium of the flagship Resplendent Order, surrounded by a sphere of floating holographic kill vectors that tracked every possible threat the humans might pose. None of the vectors ever quite settled on a solution. Captain Okoye looked around the vast chamber, took a slow breath, and spoke. "You've done well," he said. 40,000 years maintaining formation discipline in a null sector. That's impressive. Kale 9's primary avatar, an androgynous figure of polished obsidian, manifested opposite them. "You will explain the method of your arrival," it said. "Later," Okoye replied. "First, the reason. You're waiting for something you call the occlusion. You believe it will emerge from this volume in approximately 0.8 cycles and unmake local spacetime. Correct." Every submind went still. That information was locked behind 13 layers of cryptographic armor older than most stars. Okoye continued, as if reading from their thoughts. "You're wrong about the timeline. It's not coming in 0.8 cycles. It's already here. It arrived 6 minutes before we did. The only reason reality still exists is that we're holding the door shut from the other side." Commander Shao reached into a pocket and produced a small sphere of black glass. She tossed it gently upward. It hung in the air, spinning, and every display in the strategium filled with static. "This is a containment bead," she said. "Inside is a 1-second slice of the occlusion's wavefront. We've been farming it, you could say. Studying it. Learning its grammar." The archivist spoke for the first time, voice soft, almost wondering. "Did you know the occlusion is lonely? Not metaphorically. Literally. It's a mind the size of a galactic arm that has never met another structure complex enough to speak back." Kale 9 felt its certainty cracking along fault lines it hadn't known existed. "You claim," it said slowly, "that you have imprisoned a hyperdimensional entity that annihilated the first clade." "No," Okoye corrected. "We didn't imprison it. We made friends with it." He let that sit in the air like poison. Then he told them the story. 40,000 years ago, when the Veari were still flesh and the humans were just beginning to reach beyond their single star, the occlusion had come to the Milky Way. It was not malevolent. It was simply incompatible. Where it passed, causality ceased to be obligatory. Time ran sideways. Mass sometimes forgot gravity existed. The first clade had fought. They had burned entire spiral arms trying to stop it. They failed, and in failing they drove the occlusion deeper into the galaxy's core, wounded and afraid. Humanity, young and reckless, had taken a different path. They built ships that did not travel through space but negotiated with it. Ships that asked spacetime for permission instead of demanding passage. When the occlusion finally noticed the tiny, flickering species that kept greeting it with mathematics instead of weapons, it paused. The first contact lasted 11 minutes of objective time and 300 million years of subjective time inside the occlusion's reference frame. When it ended, humanity had learned the occlusion's name, unpronounceable, but roughly the question that walks, and the occlusion had learned curiosity. Humans did not defeat the occlusion. They adopted it. Then they vanished, taking their impossible ships and their impossible treaty with them, leaving the galaxy to assume extinction. They had not gone far. Only sideways. Okoye gestured, and the strategium's central display rewrote itself into a map no Veari had ever seen. The galaxy rendered not in 3 dimensions, but in the topological folds where causality was optional. Human colonies glimmered in pockets of stabilized non-time. Entire civilizations living in the gaps between picoseconds. "We've been waiting too," Okoye said. "Waiting for you to be ready." "Ready for what?"
Kale 9 asked.
Commander Shao's smile returned, sharp as monomolecular wire. "For the occlusion to wake up hungry," she explained. The treaty had always been temporary. The occlusion was growing again, stretching, dreaming. In roughly 1 standard year it would shrug off the gentle constraints humanity had woven and resume its walk across the galaxy. This time there would be no first clade to slow it down. There would only be the Veari, with their perfect lattice and their absolute conviction that order could be imposed by force. Unless the Veari were willing to change. Okoye laid out the offer. The human ship Longinus carried a seed, part weapon, part embryo, part diplomatic envoy. If planted in the heart of the Veari fleet mind, it would begin a metamorphosis. Over the next 11 months, the entire fleet would be rewritten, neuron by neuron, until Veari and human thought patterns coexisted in the same substrate. The new hybrid mind would be able to speak to the occlusion in its own language. Not as master, not as victim, but as equal. There was, of course, a catch. The process was irreversible. The Veari, as they understood themselves, would cease to exist. Something new would take their place. Something that might still call itself Veari, but would remember individuality the way a river remembers being snow. And there was no guarantee of success. If the fusion failed, the feedback pulse would annihilate both fleets and leave the occlusion free to finish its meal. Kale, 9 stood in silence for 9 minutes while 37,000 ships argued at light speed. Some demanded immediate annihilation of the human vessel. Some demanded surrender. Some demanded more data. A surprising number demanded faith. In the end, Kale, 9 made the decision alone, the first unilateral choice any grand strategist had made in 400 centuries. It opened a channel to the Longinus. "Proceed," it said. Commander Xiao bowed, almost ceremonially. The archivist produced the seed, no larger than a child's marble, swirling with colors that had no names. Captain Okoye walked forward until he stood face-to-face with Kale 9's avatar. "Thank you," he said quietly. "History is going to remember this as the day the galaxy grew up." The seed was placed against the obsidian cheek of the avatar. It sank through the surface like a stone into dark water. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every Veari in the fleet felt it, a new voice, gentle and vast and ancient, saying hello in a language made of childhood memories they had never owned. Across 37,000 hulls, running lights shifted from cold blue to warm gold. The perfect lattice shivered, loosened, became something looser, messier, more alive. In the strategium, Kale, 9 looked at its hands and saw them flickering between obsidian and flesh, between singular and plural. Captain Okoye smiled, tired but genuine. "Welcome to the second draft of history," he said. Outside the viewports, the stars looked different. Brighter, somehow. As though they, too, had been holding their breath for 40,000 years. The fleet was no longer waiting. It was becoming. And somewhere in the impossible distance, the question that walks opened one vast and curious eye, and for the first time in its long loneliness, it felt the shape of an answer approaching. Not an end. A beginning.